this Downtown Aviation Economy and Innovation Subcommittee for the month of February. I'm Daniel Valenzuela, Phoenix City Council member for District 5, and I'm honored to chair this subcommittee with my colleagues, Councilwoman Thelda Williams from District 1 and Councilwoman Laura Pastor from District 4, and I believe on the phone we have Councilman Michael Nowakowski from District 7. The first item on the agenda is always a call to the public. We will also end this meeting with the call to the public, and for those who are watching at home or in public, you can fill out a speaker's card for any of these items. Just a reminder for all of us that the public gets the first and the last word, and frankly, you can speak on any of these items that you wish. And we don't have any cards for the beginning. So we'll go to the next item, which is the approval of the meeting minutes from January 4th. Do we have a motion?
Move approval.
Second.
A motion and a second. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Motion passes. The next item is up, items are in the consent agenda, items 2, 3, and 4. Would any of my colleagues like to make a motion or pull an item out of this consent agenda just to discuss?
I'm comfortable. I would move approval.
Second.
Okay, we have a motion and a second for the consent. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Motion passes. Before we go to item 5, I do want to take an item out of order. We'll take item 6 first. Sky Harbor's Comprehensive Asset Management Plan. Then we'll go back to 5.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman and members of the subcommittee. The item we would like to discuss with you today is our proposal to engage in a comprehensive asset management plan for Sky Harbor Airport. I'm joined here this afternoon by Jordan Feld, our Deputy Aviation Director for Planning and Environmental. Very simply put, what we are proposing today is this asset management plan. Sky Harbor Airport is roughly a 3,000-acre campus, which, given the size and complexity of Sky Harbor, is a fairly small campus for a major international airport. And we have a responsibility to Phoenix to make sure that that 3,000-acre campus serves the community's air transportation needs in a very efficient and effective manner. And that 3,000-acre campus is not going to really get any larger than those 3,000 acres. So we need to make sure that as we progress with aviation here in Phoenix, that we use that resource as efficiently as possible. And that's what we would like to discuss with you this afternoon as a way forward in taking a look at that. So with that, unless there are questions, I'll ask Jordan Feld to walk you through the proposal.
Thank you, Mr. Bennett. Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, very quickly. So a comprehensive asset management plan looks at our core systems, and you can kind of see a brief representation of what those functional areas are. And I'll move extremely quickly unless there are questions, but essentially these key systems, we look at where we're at today with them. That's our baseline analysis. We compare that to what we expect the needs will be over time, and we look at alternatives to try to provide that service or improve those facilities, again, whether it's the roadways or the security systems. And it's a comprehensive look, so all of the different processors and things that go into an efficient airport get reviewed in this process. It is relatively quick, as you can see. We are expecting to get to alternatives analysis and financial planning within about 1.5 years. And so by the end of 2018, we should be completely through the process. Today's request is for recommendation of the subcommittee to the City Council to enter into negotiations with Recondo and Associates. That was the selected firm. After an open RFQ process, a panel selected Recondo. We, of course, have done work with Recondo in the past and very comfortable with that selection. So happy to answer any questions.
Councilwoman Williams?
I assume other airports have something very similar.
They do.
And having been around this airport for a long time, I don't think we've tackled this for a long time, and I think the timing is good. We need to have a very comprehensive review at a planning stage. We depend on this airport not only for the city of Phoenix, but the state of Arizona. And we need to maximize every square inch of that property. And I think it is great that you are moving ahead with this, and I totally support it. I guess my question would be, when they have the review, do you bring it back to the subcommittee? Do you run it through PAB? I mean, what's the next step after this?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Councilwoman, excellent question. Correct. So first, we'll have a stakeholder program that identifies technical advisory members and public advisory members. So there's a very robust public process that leads to these technical reports, then to your point, come back through the Phoenix Aviation Advisory Board, the subcommittee, and eventually the full city council.
Okay. And you would include the airlines and everybody as part of this review, I assume.
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions or comments from my colleagues? Councilwoman Pastor.
Yes, I would like to know how big is the panel that is, you get information from, who chooses the public that participates on this group, and who's part of it?
Mr. Chairman, Councilwoman, thank you again. So typically, once a contract is entered into, we will work with the consultant who has on their team public outreach experts that help staff identify who the members should be. Of course, the airport is fairly knowledgeable about the technical stakeholders, so it becomes a question of, who are the regional and community interests that need to be involved at the different points. And that first step in the process is really creating that stakeholder involvement program. So there's certainly flexibility, and any input from the subcommittee can go into forming that plan.
Mr. Chair, Councilwoman Pastor, there is no a rule that governs how big or and diverse it is or is not, and so this is totally a locally controlled thing. And the expectation is that staff would consult with the council offices that are impacted particularly by this airport, and as well as broadly, to make sure there's a full, diverse, and inclusive representation from both the technical users of the airport and the communities that are impacted by the airport's operation. And so you would expect staff to come back by each of your offices to get feedback from you about those that would do best support for your constituents and represent the issues related to this comprehensive asset management plan.
Thank you. And then the other piece is, my understanding, or you can correct me if I'm wrong, is that it's going to cost $3.6 million, but we would be reimbursed by the FAA. And is it the total cost?
Mr. Chairman, Councilwoman, the FAA will pay for the majority of it. Approximately $3 million is through a federal grant. The balance is paid for by the airport.
Okay, so then we've applied for this grant, or?
Actually, Mr. Chairman, the Councilwoman Pastor, I think the grant was awarded in September of 2016. So the grant has already been awarded. It's up
It's
to us
catching
now
up,
to
yeah.
start, get under contract and get the program
Get it moving,
advanced.
and then we'll be reimbursed.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
I think that this is incredibly important for our city. We are preparing to invest in expanding the SkyTrain, and we're going to invest in the Terminal 4 concourse build out, and to make, both of those things are going to continue to make the airport as user friendly as possible. And this is timely that we are doing this. I think it's being done responsibly. So I am supportive Do we have any other questions or comments from my colleagues? If not, you can entertain a motion.
Move approval.
Second.
Motion and a second. All in favor, say aye.
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 Motion passes unanimously. Thank you. And Mr. Bennett, if you can stay there, we'll go back to item 5, the FAA flight path update.
Mr. Chairman and members of the subcommittee, this will actually be a fairly brief discussion by Mr. Feld. There's not a lot that has transpired other than we're in the preparation mode for oral arguments on March the 17th.
That is staff's presentation. Other than that, we did have the opportunity to recently meet with Congressman Gallego and brief him in his office and continue to work with our federal delegation. Other than that, happy to answer any questions or take any concerns.
Any questions or comments? Well, I appreciate it. This is a standing item on this particular subcommittee. As we were dealing with all of the flight path noise, we felt that it would be appropriate to have this standing item on this agenda. It gives people an opportunity to come out and get the latest information, give them a microphone, an opportunity to speak up, and I think it served us very well, and thank you for continuing to show up and supporting us here. Thank you. Okay, we'll move on to item 7. Phoenix Convention Center Food and Beverage Update, Program Update.
Mr. Chair, members of the subcommittee, the convention center operates with a variety of revenue streams and is fundamentally a service organization that delivers a facility in support of tourism, but principally the meeting business. And food and beverage is a central part of the revenues that are produced by business operations at the convention center. And the contract that was entered into at the time the convention center was remodeled and had brand new buildings and opened is coming due. And so we thought we would come and share with you the thrust of what, both background, the thrust of where we think is going on, and to get your advice and counsel before we come back for a final proposed action. So, John and Kevin are here today to share that information with you.
Thank you, Paul. Mr. Chairman and members of the subcommittee, joined by Kevin Manley, who oversees our operations division, which includes food and beverage program. So we're going to provide a high-level overview of the program. The current contract we are under expires in April of 2018, so a little more than a year from now. And in our experience, it's not too early to begin that dialogue and process now. But before we get into the actual RFP process, we have some recommendations relative to industry best practices and timing of the current contract that we'd like to propose to the subcommittee for consideration. So as Paul indicated, since the opening of the expanded convention center in 2006, we've really focused on positioning our food and beverage program as a premium offering. So when we talk about premium offerings, it's really talking about providing clients with the options for customizable menu options, upgraded decor in China and seating options, and world-class service. So these are all part of the premium brand that we're positioning ourselves in this market. And that is these days becoming more important to meeting planners and convention attendees, because as we're learning, the shift in the industry, it's more about the experience. So, coming to Phoenix to have a convention is great for business, but a lot of the attendees, they want the experience, and that includes, not only the amenity packages in downtown, but things to go and see and do outside, throughout the state, but also having that premium food and beverage experience that we strive to provide. So with that, Kevin is going to talk a little bit in detail about some of the different offerings within the food and beverage program.
Good afternoon, members of the subcommittee. As John and Paul both stated, the Phoenix Convention Center is on the forefront of our industry. We're one of the top 25 convention centers. Yeah, I do wish. In North America. And as such, our food and beverage contract will be highly sought after by the various companies who are in this business. Probably a half a dozen companies are in a position, international firms, to bid on our business and meet the standards that we've set forth. Again, our standards are that this isn't about convention center chicken. This is about first-rate, absolutely impeccable service at the convention center and creating that experience for all of our attendees. So we expect very high attention towards this, and we know that they'll bring their A game. We want to make sure they do. So again, the emphasis being on premium and service quality, and not just for banquets, though. Our expectation of potential bidders is that they're able to be flexible. They can do banquets, they can do small services, they can do off-site catering, and they can even go mobile on the street or wherever we need it to be. And there is no exception to the rule of premium service when we go mobile. We expect the same quality food served on the street as we do in our one of our banquet halls or ballrooms.
Right, and Kevin, could you talk a little bit, because I think I want to make folks understand that the campus of the convention center is not just the buildings. Why don't you just take just 30 seconds to help remind the council of how you have currently been using some of the public streets.
Okay, so, and Paul's correct. The convention center, as you know, is three separate convention buildings, but also Symphony Hall, Orpheum Theater, and 3rd Street from Monroe to Washington is bookable space for us. And we do events out there, some of them quite large, related to professional football, baseball. Coming up, the NCAA Men's Final Four will have an activation on 3rd Street. But we also expect our caterer to do off-site catering. So any number of clients from around the valley could book them to bring food to an off-site location, not at the Phoenix Convention Center, here even, if that was desirable. So whether it's backstage catering at Symphony Hall or a fundraising gala for one of the resident companies in Symphony Hall, all of this is lumped together in an exclusive contract for whoever the successful bidder might be. So included, by the way, in addition to banquets and very well done luncheons and dinners, we have a retail foods component. We have a portion of the convention center we call the Metro Marché, which is a nice way of saying we have food court and retail foods available in all the exhibition space. Well, again, we're not satisfied with hot dogs and chicken strips coming out of our concession stands. And so we're looking for a bidder who can meet our expectations and continue our involvement of local firms in our food court. If you were to go into Metro Marché today, you'll find 4 local vendors who open on an event demand basis and are able to provide everything from pretzels from a food truck, former food truck who's now got a stand in the convention center to sell his wares, to Mexican food in Southwest, and the gamut, really. But the overriding factor is that each of these brings something unique, so that the offerings in the convention center are very different from what you'll find in other convention centers. Now, there's a financial side to this that's very important. This diagram shows the net revenues and the commissions paid since 2008, which is the life of the current contract. And you can see 2009 is when the expansion of the convention center occurred, and we shed our Civic Plaza logo and we changed our game. And you can see what happened right away in 2009. We had the Great Recession that we've come out of, and you'll notice in the last 2 years that the revenue to the convention center has been in excess of $7 million. And the gross sales being above $20 million, I'm sorry, net sales above $20 million. It's important to note here the difference between 20 and 7 seems like, well, we've given away a lot of money, but I want to point out that the concessionaire takes all the costs for personnel, for administration, for purchasing the food, for all the labor, for all the insurance. All of those cares are taken away from us, and instead of having all that on staff, all those folks on staff, which is more than 200 people, instead we collect commissions of more than $7 million for the past 2 years. This is a model in the industry that's pretty standard. It's rare you find a convention center with in-house catering. And finding one of our size with in-house catering, I'm not certain that's possible.
The other thing I'll add is that for some of our larger conventions, it's not uncommon for the client to spend $1 million just on catering when they're here for their convention. So that's pretty commonplace.
Yeah, on that point, in the Civic Plaza days, if they did $1 million in a month, we celebrated. We would be celebrating every month if that were the case at the convention center. So this is a big deal and a lot of money. So now, going forward into the RFP process, we have 3 primary goals that are on the screen here. Quality, I think we've overmentioned. Greatest financial return is a given. We have a very beneficial structure now. We expect it to get competitive, and we expect to let them fight it out for our financial gain. But the third bullet point is where, as a deputy for operations, that I'm focused on, and that is minimizing client impact. And that's important because the current contract expires on April 1st, 2018. And on April 1st, 2018, we have an international convention in-house, one that we fought for and finally secured. And minimizing their impact on April 1 is vitally important to us. Essentially, if we allow this contract to expire on April 1st, this client will deal with catering company A for 2 days and possibly another catering company on the remaining days. And you can imagine just how chaotic that could be. And so it's a condition we would like to avoid if possible. So in order to make this process run smoothly, because we do expect it to be competitive, is our first goal is transparency. We want all of our bidders to come in understanding exactly what the lay of the land is and exactly what our expectations are so that they can meet our expectations and have a good, fair fight over our business. Secondly, industry best practices, which is a tricky term, but our expectation for them is that if they have to, they'll invent a new best practice and outshine what the rest of the industry is doing. And finally, we're concerned with transition timing for this contract. In consideration, we've come today not just to provide you with this information and our opinion, our professional opinion on this, but we would like your input on this point. Ending this contract on April 1st is recipe for problems with a very sought-after client that we want to keep, and they like coming here. And so we've examined the schedule, looking for a date when there's no business. And we have a really good problem in that was hard to do. But we found a week, the week of December 18. And as you know, we ramp into Christmas and the New Year's holiday, business tends to fall off. We do some charity work, Salvation Army and that kind of thing, but most folks aren't traveling out of town for a convention close to Christmas. And so we've identified that week as, frankly, the one and only week in calendar year 2018. There's a window there that lasts about 13 days, and that's our time to transition if we have to. And so we are exploring the possibility of a contract extension in order to get us to this window and make a seamless transition. One other thing we'd like you to think about is the complexity of this contract and the caliber of the companies that will bid on this contract demands that we have professional advice from folks who have done this more than once. On our staff, there's very few people remaining who were here in 2007 and 2008 when we did this before. And as knowledgeable and as much faith as I have in our staff, I think it would behoove us to seek consultation in the industry in order to make this RFP run as smoothly as we can.
So I think to wrap up essentially what Kevin is describing, there are 2 things that we would want to propose for the council, for the subcommittee to consider. One is the ability for us to go and hire a consultant that would advise us in going through this RFP process, somebody that has represented convention centers and cities in the past that can help us develop the criteria and maximize the return to the city and the quality that we desire. And then the second thing that Kevin talked about relative to timing would essentially amount to about a 9-month extension of the current contract so that we avoid any potential disruption to our clients, during any potential transition. So those are the two things that we wanted to talk about and get your feedback on today.
And, Mr. Chair, members of the subcommittee, what John and Kevin have described are some operational one's operational, one is construction of the RFP, but we also want to hear your feedback about your experience on service areas that we should think about innovating based on, you all are consumers in the marketplace and really want to have any advice you have of things you would like us to consider as we're proceeding through the RFP. And there is no action for today. This is an opportunity to hear from you both now and the weeks ahead, and then we would come back on a future agenda with any action items. But certainly one of those would be the formation of an RFP sometime months ahead from now.
Councilman Nowakowski?
I don't have a problem having a consultant come in and explain to us where we can actually save some money and make some money. But I was wondering how much that would cost us, right? And if you can come back to us later, unless you have a price tag of how much a consultant would cost to guide us in that process.
Councilman, we haven't yet reached that point where we would have a budget. I think a lot of it depends on the scope of how extensive we want that consultant to be on board with us.
But Mr. Chair and members of the subcommittee, I think for breadbasket aircraft carrier territory, this isn't $100,000. It will be, I think John and I have talked about, and please don't hold us to it because we don't know what we don't know, but this feels like this is in somewhere in the $40,000 to $50,000 range for their services across the next 18 months or so.
And then the other thing too is that we have the Orpheum and other facilities. We've been really catering a lot to the nonprofit world and to charities, especially after in 2009 we just rocketed. I mean, once we opened, we were making a big profit. Then SB 1070 hit us, and a lot of conventions were basically canceling. And then we hit a down, and now it seems like it's coming back up. And I'm not sure what's going to happen with the future of if there's going to be any type of boycotts or anything against our state or our city or any of that stuff. Saying all that, I think that the nonprofits and local groups came in and really started using our facilities. And one of the biggest complaints I hear, and also as a consumer, is like when we use the Orpheum, they try to find those corners to cut expenses and use the plaza area as a way to have cocktails or even finger foods and stuff. You have to work through the caterer. That happens to be quite expensive for a nonprofit or a charity group. Is there a way to actually find creative ways or innovative ways where we can actually help some of those local groups where we don't have a contract where the vendor is dealing with our plaza area? Inside the Orpheum, it's a whole different story. But on the deck itself, I think that we should be a little more flexible. And when you talk about street and mobile units and all that, their contract doesn't extend into the streets, right? So if people wanted to have a festival and bring in different ethnic foods and all that, they don't have to use the caterer on 2nd Street or on 3rd Street or 4th Street, right?
Okay. So let me address a couple of things, Councilman Nowakowski. In terms of the exclusivity, one of the reasons why we're able to negotiate such a high commission structure is because whoever comes in and as the caterer for the convention center, they have to make a significant investment into the operation. And so part of that in exchange is that exclusivity. Having said that, I think that we do have a history of working and being flexible with some of the nonprofits, especially on pricing and things like that. And that certainly is something that we can improve on in terms of working with those nonprofits. But that's something that we've done and should continue to do. As far as the exclusivity on the streets, the only portion of our campus where the exclusivity applies to is on Third Street, because that by ordinance is rentable space. And so that is where if we did an extension of premise on a liquor license, that would have to be, that's the only place where we generally would do that.
Mr. Chair, Councilman Nowakowski, the plaza out in front of the Orpheum Theater is not part of the Orpheum Theater. I think that can very easily and will be more flexible. The atrium of City Hall is another location that has been used a lot in conjunction with the Orpheum, because oftentimes the lobby of the Orpheum is actually
Right.
not very big. It's not always super easy to use. And I think, as you know, John described, there has been some examples in the past where we do our best to work on how do we work with nonprofits, and maybe that's a topic we can explore more and bring back to the subcommittee with some more ideas.
And the other thing I'd like to look into is if we do hire a consultant, the whole living wage aspect of it too, is that we have our employees in there mixed with city employees, and our employees have benefits, and sometimes these catered or these vendors aren't giving the same type of benefits to their employees. So we want to make sure that at least the morale of individuals working together they're kind of getting the same type of benefits, maybe not the same medical plan, but at least some type of medical plan. And that that if you make the employees happy, then the customer service and the reflection of our convention centers out there also. So to look at those kind of things too. But besides that, I've been hearing all kinds of positiveness about the food, the service that people are receiving at our convention center, and especially in that food court area. The mixture of local businesses is great, so keep that up. Thank you.
Councilwoman Williams?
Thank you. Following up on the wages, does the new state law apply to this type of contract? Would they have to pay the minimum wage and the benefits that's now prescribed?
Councilwoman Williams, members of the subcommittee, yes, the law applies to all businesses in Arizona, and we've recently crossed this bridge with everyone at the convention center.
Okay, because I think that probably reduces some of the problem you were talking about. I also would like to have a list of how often the nonprofits use some of these other facilities. And is it because we book them first or lack of bookings? Because recently I've had a couple complaints that we contribute a lot to them and they no longer need it. The recession is over, and if we could get more profitable bookings in there, that's what we should be doing. So I have not a clue how this shakes out, but I would really like some more information on it. I'm wondering is there a way also to, if you have, I know we want a first tier. I understand how important that is. But for some of those off-site, can you have a second small contract that's maybe not quite as exclusive food? And if so, or would they hire, you talked about some local vendors working that in on a DPE, whatever?
We will.
I'm leaving it to you to bring back ideas, but I
Okay,
think
and
it's
that's
important
a
to
current
consider.
practice, and we're happy to make sure that we reinforce that as part of an RFP, working with local businesses and being that partner. Yes.
Because not everyone, when they go in your food court area, since I can't pronounce your other name,
That's two of us.
that they want the buck item. They don't want the $10 item. You know, it's great to have those at meals when somebody else is picking up the bill, but when it's coming out of your own pocket, sometimes you think a little less expensive. And I think it's important that that's an opportunity that we could include some people.
That's something that we talk about all the time is value, perceived value for what you're getting, especially at a food court. And, I think the difference now is that, the attendees have options. They don't have to stay on the campus. And so it's not entirely a captive audience. So, the caterer needs to be competitive in that respect.
Thank you. And I'm supporting with hiring, going out and getting a consultant.
Councilwoman Pastor?
I think what we really need to look at in the food area is really flexibility. and flexibility in the ranges of prices. And what I mean by that is, and I don't know if it works here because it might be a different scenario, but like at the community colleges, we have a standard operator. But if I want to bring something, I want a different choice than that.
Cultural thing or something.
Yeah, I have to get 3 bids or 3 proposals, and I also get a proposal from that operator on site. If the 3 bids come in and the one of the bids is I can purchase that food lower than the operator on the site, then I'm able then to go with that operator. I'm not sure how it be structured or how you look at it, but those are some of the flexibilities that we have at the community college to be able then to look at other caterers that possibly may be lower in price in order for us to do business on the college. So I'm not really sure.
Sure, Councilwoman Pastor, when we have this consultant on board, we can get the precise definition of how the practice varies around the country, because the principal customers that we're working with, the vast majority of them fall into a pretty common space, but it's in those exceptions that are the pain points that you all deal with. I think we can understand how exceptions exist. Are there things that are carve-outs, et cetera? But the key thing though is there's all the balloon bulges when you squeeze it in one place. It's going to bulge somewhere else, and so we just need to manage that, help you understand what that means, and discover how we can create the flexible options, both around price and choice of menu if the need can't be met otherwise. So we'll absolutely do that.
And I guess what I'm saying is we need to be flexible also due to the fact that because there's also they have the opportunity to go wherever they want within the state and within the city, and so to be flexible enough where we're attracting people, but also being competitive enough to draw, I guess, revenue into our city.
We agree. We agree.
It's kind of that fine balance.
We
So
agree.
Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions or comments by my colleagues? I think there's some good information. I think the consensus is I think we all agree that it would be a good thing to talk with someone who can come in and help us maximize our potential here with food and beverage. And I also like the idea of making sure that we're in a position of strength if we have to change who we're working with, meaning if we have to extend the current contract for a few months to make sure that we are protecting the city and the convention center. I think that's also a wise move as well.
Okay.
So this is just for information and feedback, and I think that's it for this.
Thank you for your feedback.
Thank you. Moving on to the next item, 8, parking improvements text amendment. This is also for information and discussion. Alan Stevenson is joining us, as well as Sandy Hoffman and Tricia Gomes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the subcommittee. This is an issue that has been around for a little while now. It dates back to really the early 1990s when the city heard a lot about how come there was not enough infill development happening inside the city. The city continued to grow in the suburbs, and we weren't doing enough to facilitate infill development. And we heard loud and clear from residents, back then and continue to, about the exciting things that can happen related to infill development. So the city pursued things like a light rail line, adaptive reuse program updates, and we've been very successful to the tune of having about 3,500 residential units under construction in along the light rail line in downtown. A number of very successful restaurants that have gone in through our adaptive reuse program. This is an issue that we are seeking to address that is really one that is the growing pains from some of that success. And so The item before you today is a proposed text amendment to the zoning ordinance to add some additional parking requirements in to address the issue with the yard. I won't go into a lot of details. I think everyone is very much aware of the yard and some of the implications of that, but it was an old motorcycle shop and car dealership that converted to a series of restaurants and was wildly successful. One of the challenges that this text amendment or this development brought forward is some shortcomings in our parking requirements related to the zoning ordinance. And so staff did put together a steering committee to work through a number of these issues that was comprised of residents and development committee folks. And we're going to summarize some of those items that are coming for you today. So the first one is adding a parking requirement for outdoor recreational area uses. In the case of the yard, those outdoor spaces where they play ping pong and beanbag toss, there's no parking requirement for those currently in the ordinance. That was a contributor to the parking challenges faced in the yard. Also having some standardized stipulation language regarding parking requests. So these are things like having in standard stipulation language to designate a manager for a new facility that can be the contact person with the neighborhood to address issues so that they're not having to call the city and trying not to get hold of anyone after hours to address issues. Having some standardized valet parking policies, clarifying our use permit revocation process, as well as our right-of-way parking allowance via use permit. And with that, I'm going to introduce Ms. Hoffman, who's going to walk us through the details of those.
Thank you, Chairman Valenzuela and subcommittee members. One of the things that we're moving forward is a text amendment to include the parking requirements for outdoor recreation areas. We've added a definition, and we're going to require 1 to 200 square feet parking for where there's programmed outdoor recreation area. So if this was the yard, they would basically have to do approximately 22 additional spaces with this if this text amendment was in place at the time. The other thing, as Alan mentioned, is we're going to have a STIP library for our zoning adjustment hearing officers. So anytime anybody has a case that impacts the parking or is modifying the parking requirements, there are stipulations that they can look at and refer to ensure that they're addressing any of the concerns that the neighbors may have, such as Alan mentioned, having the contact information, as well as parking mitigation tools, which include such things as off-site parking for their employees, the valet parking, as he mentioned, and perhaps adding bicycle parking. And the valet parking policy is something that we haven't had established, and we needed to have this. This, again, gives guidance and assurance to developers as well as staff that do the review to look at the different elements when you have valet parking. So again, the valet parking should occur on private property, needs to minimize the impact to that single-family neighborhood that might be near it, be safe and effective, and again, define where that off-site parking would be allowed. And we updated our zoning adjustment handout. Now, this is hard to read, but basically it's a multi-page document that we give out to the public. It's available. It goes into all kinds of details regarding how you would apply for a zoning adjustment. But in there, what we have done is updated how you would do a use permit revocation, because we never had clear direction. When is it appropriate to do that? And so what that includes now in that handout is if there is material noncompliance and with the conditions prescribed because of a use permit or the variance with the parking reduction, then the zoning administrator, sitting to my right, actually has the ability to collect the data and to make an evaluation, and we can revoke a use permit with that information.
Is that information going to be online? I mean, a handout's
Sure,
good, but no one looks there anymore.
Certainly, Chairman Valenzuela, Councilwoman Williams, we certainly are going to have all this information online. I believe we do have the updated document available to be placed online so that any public could see that, and we can certainly find other methods that may be recommended to try to highlight that so that people are well aware of that as something that can give direction.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Chairman Valenzuela, Councilwoman Williams, just by way of clarifying a little bit, it isn't adding new authority that wasn't there. The city's always had the authority to revoke a use permit. It's trying to set up some clear parameters so that we can force a discussion between a neighborhood group who is dealing with some of the negative impacts of some of these and the business operator to try and get them to sit down and have a discussion about those issues and try and resolve them as as good neighbors should, instead of both sides, going to you guys and complaining that, hey, I'm getting impacted as a neighbor, and then on the same hand, you're hearing the business side of it saying, hey, we're doing great work for the larger community, we're wildly supportive, but this is really to get those folks sitting in the room and trying to make them have a discussion about it. And so it puts in that language to kind of clarify some of those things.
Okay, and if it doesn't get resolved at that level, what's the next step?
So there could be no revocation without a public hearing process. So they'd have to go back through a public hearing process. Let's say a worst-case scenario where someone was not able to work things out and they were deficient in addressing something they were stipulated to do. We would work with them through NSD to collect information to warn them, to say, look, you were supposed to, let's say, not have any outdoor music, after 10 p.m. Here on these dates, we've told you, the neighbors have told you, you've, flaunted your nose at us for that. Then the city does have that ability to have a revocation hearing back through the zoning adjustment hearing process, where both sides could present testimony related to the issue. That would then go to the Board of Adjustment, ultimately to Superior Court.
Okay, so it doesn't come through council?
Correct.
That's bottom line, I guess, is what I'm asking. Okay,
Right.
thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you. So the graphic on the screen is the infill development area. And so within the infill area, there's certain conditions that help support development. And so one of the proposals that we have for a text amendment is to allow development within the infill development district to utilize the right-of-way for some required parking. Right now, if you're in the infill development district, you're allowed to use that right-of-way adjacent to your parcel as part of your required parking. But what this would do would be allow, with a use permit, the ability to have parking up to 300 feet along the right-of-way from the edge of your property. You would, again, have to have a use permit, you would have to have a neighborhood meeting, and there's some conditions such as a parking restriction waiver form that needs to be signed. I'll go over a little graphic in a minute. And again, there could be some stipulations that might be required through that process, such as painting curbing with red where we don't want to have parking. So the graphic on the screen portrays a site with the red where it could be a commercial piece of property, infill development district. They can park right adjacent to their property if there's sufficient room. What this would allow is if you, within a quarter mile, 1,320 feet, if you don't have any single family property that faces that right-of-way, then you have the ability to move forward with requesting to have the parking within that 300 feet. And you need to have the properties, the single-family properties within that 300 feet, sign a waiver, a petition that says that they're okay to waive their rights to restrict parking. So that would be one condition that would need to be done for that.
Hang on. To restrict parking?
To not restrict
Oh,
parking.
not to restrict. I heard restrict.
I'm sorry, I apologize.
Oh.
So to not move forward with having a parking restriction in that area.
Okay, so then they would have to get a petition or all the neighbors to agree? I'm sorry, can you just give me some clarity?
So the properties of single-family homes, the single-family residences that touch that 300-foot area would sign a petition that says, we understand that there will be parking in that right-of-way for a commercial business, and we will waive our right because there's some neighborhood parking programs that you want to restrict parking in your neighborhood. You understand that you're waiving your right to restrict the parking there because it would then be, again, allowed for that commercial use to utilize it.
And that's in the yellow area?
Yes.
Okay, so then they would sign something, does it have to be a majority? What's the percentage? Every single family owner has to sign that petition?
Chairman Valenzuela and Councilwoman Pastor, yes, 100% of the single-family property owners must sign the petition.
And then they are waiving restrictions for that parking area, or for that area.
Correct, Chairman, Councilman Pastor, in the yellow area. So
Right.
the yellow area, because you're the ones that are parking adjacent to you, you have some more rights associated with that. The rest in the blue area is just the area to look at in terms of, do you have homes that front on there that would be impacted by more traffic driving back and forth? But they're not required to sign.
So is this, I don't know what I want to call it, a petition or a signature sheet of the 300, is that for one night? Is that for, how long is that invalid for?
So basically, when you go through your use permit hearing, there could be stipulations. So again, as the neighborhood can come out during that public hearing to comment on it, the hearing officer could perhaps restrict the time frame. So public parking between the hours of 7 in the morning and 10 at night, something like that, it could be posted. The developer would have to pay for any kind of improvements, the signage and such, to limit the time frame for that. So the advantage is that that would be striped, and it's not limited to just the commercial business using that parking in the right-of-way. So that would be open to anybody in the public using that parking, but it helps to define where that parking would be located. And because of some feedback we got during our parking standard study group, we realized that it's better to have some spaces delineated, so then it gives direction to the public into where to park.
Okay, so I guess once again, obviously it goes through a hearing. They're just giving up their rights for permanently, or they have to bring it back to our hearing officers. Say I sell that house and a new owner comes in and the new owner says, I didn't agree to this, and wants to go through a process to remove it. What is the process?
Well, so Chairman, Councilwoman Pastor, the process would be go back through a use permit. They would have to, at that point, show that something has not been complied with, because they're buying into the bundle of rights that the prior owner signed, which said, you're okay to do this. That's part of the challenge of coming up with this. Is it's the premise behind it is, if you have this additional right-of-way area and people are okay with you parking there, then let's have the private business maintain that area and stripe it so it's clear, park here, and then we'd have them paint the red curbs, down the streets. Don't park here, and then they'd be responsible for maintaining those. And that's easier for police, easier for the city to enforce. Here's the area where you park. And so if somebody came in afterwards and said, well, I don't want that anymore, they could request to have the use permit revoked and say, I no longer wish to do that. However, because they bought into something where the prior owner signed up and people have relied on that, that would be somewhat difficult to do unless they weren't complying with, the rules and requirements like hours of operation or something like that, because they, bought into that as part of their, when they bought the property, those are the conditions.
Well, let's get clear on that, because a realtor will not know, or would be able to say, or an owner or a seller, and I'm a buyer and I'm purchasing that property and not really aware of these agreements, and I purchase the property, I wouldn't know that there was that agreement, and then it becomes difficult for that new property owner to then go through to remove a use permit, because it's now, you're not going to get the 100%.
Mm-hmm.
So, okay, I'll keep listening to the, I'll keep listening to it.
Alan, maybe to help, I think where I think the councilman is going is, if it, both for where you cannot park and where you can park, needs to be signed. Yes?
Correct,
So,
yes.
so that when someone comes to buy a home, they're gonna see signs that says public parking on this street. So I understand your concern, but there won't be surprise, I think is what Alan is trying to communicate. They'll see it coming in.
Yes, but I probably am, well, I'm probably a little different, but most property buyers don't pay attention really to when you're there in the day, and really more activity happens at night, specifically in the yard, because I am thinking of the yard. It's an issue. And so, yeah, we'll see.
I have a follow-up question. So how do you revoke it? Does it take a certain amount of people living in that yellow area to say, hey, we want to revoke this? It just wasn't a good fit for us.
So as part of the original use permit, because it takes a public hearing to actually apply it, as part of that use permit hearing, there could be stipulations put on that to, let's say, revisit that in a year. If we're unsure of this being appropriate fit to our neighborhood, to go in and revisit that in a year for a review. Something like that would be something that could be done as part of that original use permit. If it was something that everyone was okay and there were no issues, then it would be a matter of coming back and saying, you know what, all four of us no longer agree to this, and then going back and petitioning to go back through the use permit process to revoke it. And that is a public hearing process. We'd have to notify the business owner, whoever the property owners at the time, have a full public hearing about what the issues are. They would have to bring some evidence, some issue, what's changed, what's the problem with using that space anymore. So whether or not it's, yeah, people weren't as good as you said they were going to be,
Right.
I'm finding other things, then they would introduce that as evidence for revocation of the use permit. And it would be because they didn't comply with those, stipulations and requirements. And then the city has some basis for revoking the use permit.
So Alan, if a restaurant was asking for the use permit, 5 years down the road, it changes into a sports bar where there's music and dance and all that. At that time, do they actually go through the same process? Or are they just allowed to, I mean, does the neighbors have a say-so once the use, it's just different or? it
So
changes?
Chairman, Councilman Nowakowski, in the case of a change of use, those entitlements would go with the land. So it would be something that would be there as part of that. Now, if that, by the change of use, caused other changes that were problematic to the community, that's where they could come back and say, you know what, this was a nice restaurant and now it's a place that has more, noise at night, more issues that weren't part of the original use permit and the conditions that were there.
Do you have more of the presentation?
Yes, sir.
Let's
Okay.
let staff finish the presentation, and we'll pick it up again.
So this was, I described, was for if you're within the infill development district. So what we are also adding as part of a text amendment is if you're outside the infill development district, you can have 20% of your required parking in the right-of-way. Following similar process as what we did in the infill, you need that use permit for, again, this would be adjacent to your property and within 300 feet. You'd have to have a neighborhood meeting. And there's a variety of different things, again, of both programs that we need from the applicant, including indemnification and hold harmless letter, insurance that need to provide, maintenance agreement needs to be executed, and again, that petition, that waiver signed by all of the 100% of the single-family property owners. So that would be, again, part of that program. So what happened at the Planning Commission was they did approve the proposal to have 1 per 200 square foot parking spaces for 1 per 200 square feet, but they recommended that the right-of-way parking be continued and additional outreach be done to the neighborhoods and stakeholders. With that, be happy to answer any questions.
Okay, and I do have two cards that I'll just mention. Both available to speak if necessary. Lisa Lyons, Valley Partnership, who is here. Thank you for being here, Lisa. And Tony Decisions from, well, you have your own thing going on, Tony. Thank you for being here. At any point, if you wish to speak, just wave and we'll do that. So any other questions or comments by my colleagues? And we're not voting on this today. This is an update and an opportunity to give feedback, correct?
Correct.
So I have a challenge with the right-of-way parking. Because my neighborhoods have very similar situations to the yard. Not as extreme, but could go there. So I think this needs to be very much vetted in the neighborhoods, or we put it on hold at this moment. Obviously, the Planning Commission decided to put it on hold. And so that's just, I have great concerns. And I have great concerns with the 300 and that the fact that a business, say it changes hands, they have the authority to continue with that use permit when a buyer of a home doesn't have a right to come. Well, they have a right, but it's a difficult process for them then to reverse their use permit. So I think that's very interesting, and it's challenging at the same time. I do believe in adaptive reuse because in a lot of the neighborhoods, that's what's happening. But this is a fine balance that we have to, because it's a fine dance. You know, you dance this way and you move this way, and then you get in the middle and you get the rhythm. But I have witnessed, have seen, and have felt what the yard has gone through as their evolution, and have heard from those neighbors and realized that even now, with the signs that are up, it's very difficult to enforce. And so how do you enforce right now what we have? And it's kind of like we're opening up so that then there's no enforcement. So I just have I'm just kind of pushing back right now on this concept.
I want to make it clear that I first I want to thank everyone who took part, who was part of this. Thank you so much. I do have a concern, and it's regarding the on-street parking allowance. So, you know, I am a big proponent of adaptive reuse. The yard is you know, that concept. You go down several restaurants, and especially in Midtown, and that you're seeing more of that, and I think it's pretty great. You know, the 19th Avenue, I think we'll start to see a little bit of that. I hope to see more of it, frankly, being that that's part of District 5, and we have light rail now on 19th Avenue. But I would, you know, I would caution against the on-street parking allowances then as well. So that's my major concern. I think that's what I'm hearing from my colleague as well. Do we have any other questions or comments, concerns before we move forward? Councilman Nowakowski?
I just really want to thank you for bringing this up because in the downtown area, I mean, we're growing leaps and bounds, and we have the light rail that kind of gives you zero parking, and so you got to create. So you have restaurants now that aren't even required to have parking, so people need to park somewhere because not everyone takes the light rail. So that whole phenomenon of the light rail and those ordinances that we have, and those are things I think we really need to look into ourselves because I know that we were all excited saying, well, everybody's going to be jumping on the light rail and using public transportation, but it's been a while now and it hasn't been that. And I know that downtown has been really suffering about a parking solution, and we've been very creative in trying to find ways by putting up meters and parking meters all over the place. But I think we need to figure out a parking solution, especially now that the light rail is going to the north side of town, and we're talking about South Phoenix also, that we need to look at those parking ordinances that we have, especially when it's in conjunction with the light rail. So maybe that's something we can bring out to the community also and start talking about that.
Okay. Thank you so much
Thank
for
you.
your time. That brings us to, that is the last formal item. Well, I guess the last formal item is the call to the public. We don't have cards for the final call to the public. Future agenda items. Councilwoman Williams had to step out, but she did ask me if we can add to that list, just reviewing the policy on fuel tax for the airport aviation. And something we can discuss on a future agenda. Do we have any others from Councilman Nowakowski?
You know, I've met with our ex-council member, Michael Johnson. We were talking about the whole process at the airport and vendors and all that, and how we really fought and championed having local businesses and minority businesses and all that. And I was just wondering that I've been asking for a list of individuals with the SSP and the MAG and all that. So we got a report that they met the MAG, but I like to see some more detail on that. I also like to see the partnerships of each of those businesses by name, and if anybody has 1% to 100%, I like to have a list of all those individuals so we can find out how many are actually local or if it's minority owned or not, so we can actually have something to measure from. So if we can get that information, I know we're going to be talking about that in an upcoming meeting, but I'd like to have more detail, and I'd like to find out who the vendors and the owners of those restaurants are. Thank you.
All right, this meeting's adjourned. Thank you.